Hello, everyone. The other day, I was just browsing around on YouTube looking at videos. If you're watching this video, you probably do much the same thing because there's so much interesting stuff on YouTube to watch. And I came across a pastor, and he was giving a sermon. And this is someone that I've heard several times before. And generally speaking, I have found the things that he said to ring true. He was well spoken. And so I was coming to respect him. But then he started talking about something that made me really sit up and take notice. He started talking about science. And as he spoke about science, he said a number of things which I found really, frankly, very concerning. He was claiming that science can't be trusted and that science was essentially bad. And some of the reasons that he gave were just so surprising to me. I mean, one of the reasons that he gave that science wasn't to be trusted is that scientific conclusions are always changing. Well, if he knew anything about science, he would know that that's part of the nature of science. Science itself seeks to try to refute things, and as our knowledge grows, sometimes science has to change perspectives on things. I want to talk about that a little bit more later. He also talked about something called peer review. And so in peer review, which I'll talk more about later as well, he saw that as somehow a bad thing, and he referred to it as a form of prostitution. And so as I listened to his talk, I realized that there's a lot of misunderstanding on the part of people today about science, what it is, what it does, what it doesn't do, and how it relates to religion. And so today's talk, I want to explore these issues and a few more, and to give you a broader context of what's happening here, and hopefully provide a common language that whether you're a believer in the God of the Bible, a member of another faith community, or an atheist, we can at least agree on the same groundwork of the definitions that we're talking about with respect to science. So I hope you'll stay with me and listen to this. I've got a lot of ground to cover. I've got a little bit of an outline to try to help me stay on task. So thank you for joining me. I'm Jim Higgins, and this is Reflecting on Truth. Since we're talking about science today, I thought it would be a good idea to give you a little bit of a full disclosure of myself. So you kind of know where I come from. It's always a good idea whenever you listen to anybody, whether they be religious in nature, whether they be non-believers, scientists, politicians, whoever you're listening to, it's a good idea to know where are they coming from? What are their frameworks of understanding? What are their potential biases? And I want to just let you know a little bit about myself. I have been a lover of science since I was in the 5th grade. And that love really, believe it or not, started one Saturday afternoon as I was a little kid and I was watching on television Star Trek. Now, that original series, now we look at it and we see the effects and everything on it is kind of cheesy, but that original series was truly remarkable. And it actually, believe it or not, launched the careers of a great many scientists. But for me, I remember sitting there on that Saturday afternoon watching Star Trek, and I had this sense in my mind as the introductory credits rolled and you hear William Shatner's voice saying, "Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise." And so as I listened to that, I just had this sense in my mind, I want to do that. And that sparked an interest in me that's lasted my whole life. It set the ground for much of my education. It has influenced much of my professional life. And sometimes even in my sermons, I'm known to throw out an occasional Star Trek quote because those quotes often are just very profound. So it all started with Star Trek. Now, as I went through school, when I was 17 years old, I came home one day from school to an empty house, and I was just sitting there bored. And so I reached down into this magazine rack looking for something to thumb through. And down at the very bottom, I found this old book. And it had on the front two words, Holy Bible. And I thought to myself, well, what is this? And I opened it up and I noticed it was divided into Old Testament and New Testament. And since I like science fiction, I thought that the New Testament was probably science fiction. And so I decided I would start there. And the New Testament in the Bible begins with a book called the Book of Matthew, or the Gospel of Matthew. And I started reading chapter 1 and immediately realized why nobody reads this book. It was a series of names that were virtually unpronounceable to me. And I could barely get through it. I mean, I was the type of person when it came to pronunciation. There is a name of a king in the Bible called Nebuchadnezzar, and I pronounced his name Nebuchadnezzar. But once I got past that initial set of, it's called the genealogy of Jesus, which kind of talks about who his forebears were, I got to this point where it talks about the birth of Jesus. And I have to tell you, I was shocked. I had no idea this Jesus character was a real person. I mean, I used his name a lot, but it was more like a swear word or just an exclamation of some kind. And you have to understand, my idea of Christmas was the cartoons Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, and things like that, and getting presents. So finding out that there was this person behind this really startled me. And then as I read through that first little bit of the book of Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and 7, called the Sermon on the Mount, I have to tell you, this person who was raised in a non-religious household had his eyes opened. I was so amazed at what Jesus said that I was immediately hooked. And I've been hooked ever since. The values, the kind of world that he talks about, the God that he claims created all things and rules all things. I mean, to me, that was amazingly compelling. So I'm going to skip ahead. So when I went to college, I decided to actually get my degree in pastoral theology. And that's exactly what I did. And I actually graduated with a degree in pastoral theology. And after that, I went to California State University, Sacramento, where I earned a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology with an emphasis on the use of advanced statistics to evaluate human potential. And then I went on and I got my doctorate in educational psychology from University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, again, with an emphasis in using advanced statistical techniques to developing and validating cognitive assessment tools. So that's sort of my educational background, kind of a combination pastoral theology and science and research. And when I graduated, I've had a number of science-related jobs, all in the applied science field. For example, I eventually was the director of the research arm for the California Department of Mental Health, where I oversaw such projects as trying to predict and address issues of sexually violent predators, looking at what are those factors that lead to positive outcomes in community mental health programs for children and youth, adults, and older adults. I oversaw a program looking at the nexus between substance abuse and mental health disorders. And from there, I ended up working at one of the largest state-level departments of justice as an assistant director of human resources, where I oversaw programs related to data analytics, talent assessment and acquisition, risk management, and amelioration and training and education. I've been a college level professor. I was a tenure track professor at American River College, where I taught applied statistics, as well as research methods and psychology. I taught as an adjunct professor teaching fundamentals of psychological research for California State, Sacramento. And yeah, so in a nutshell, you might say that I am an applied scientist. I love statistics. I love research. I love solving practical and applied problems with the tools of science. So that's a bit about myself. So you know where I'm coming from. I am a believer that the Holy Bible is the Word of God, that it was inspired by the Spirit of God, and at the same time, I have a deep commitment to the principles and philosophy of the scientific enterprise. Which leads me to this question that I want to ask. And think about the answer to this in your own mind before I answer it. Are science and religion at odds with one another? Maybe even said more sternly, are science and religion at war with one another? Well, let me read you a couple of quotes from scientists, and at least you can get some of their perspective. Now, the quote I'm going to read now, it's from a man named Christopher Eric Hitchens. He died in 2011, but he was an atheist, an acclaimed author, an educator. And he wrote this, and listen carefully to the words, the rhetoric that he uses. Religion is a poison because it asks us to give up our most precious faculty, which is that of reason, and to believe things without evidence. It then asks us to respect this, which it calls faith. In the ordinary moral universe, the good people will do the best they can, and the worst people will do the worst they can. But if you want to make good people do wicked things, you'll need religion. So this is a statement of an acclaimed author, scientific thinker, influential author in the modern secular world. Now I want to read you a quote by Dr. Steven Weinberg. Steven Weinberg was a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and he brilliant man, awesome scientist. But he wrote in this a magazine called The New Scientist, issue number 2578, in November of 2006. This is what he said. The world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may, in fact, be our greatest contribution to civilization. Wow. Aren't those powerful statements? Don't they represent amazing claims? The only problem is they're patently false. And I'm not going to argue a whole lot with their statements, but what it should tell you is that there are scientists out there, brilliant scientists with amazing accomplishments. But these scientists come prepackaged with their own worldviews and biases that go well beyond science, that shade or color their statements, and they're often given enhanced credibility because of their science. And so to me, when I hear like what Steven Weinberg says about we need to wake up from the long religion of nightmare and anything, I mean, think about that, anything we can do, that sounds rather ominous. Anything we can do should be done and may be our greatest contribution to civilization. To me, if that's not a declaration of war on religion on the part of at least some prominent scientists, I don't know what is. So, on the other hand, is religion at war with science? Well, I'm not going to go into a bunch of quotes on this, but I mean, if there's one thing that religion is often accused of, it's an anti-intellectualism. There are a lot of people, you may have even heard this. I mean, I think Christians did themselves a huge disservice back in the day when they would say God said it, I believe it, that's all there is to it, as if that's going to shut down all discussion and leave all these questions simply unanswered. It's a simplistic way of viewing things that Christians need not have leaned on. They didn't take time to examine the propositions of their beliefs, and as a result, they did themselves a lot of disservice. And so you have a lot of people out there, like the pastor that I originally cited, who had this whole series of statements to say that is basically reject science because it's bad. So yes, I would say for many Christians, they harbor this anti-intellectualism, and because they mix it up, they confuse science with claims made by what many consider to be liberal culture, and they're two separate things. And that's what really has driven me to try to do this presentation, because I want to clear some of this up. We need to clear this up given all the rhetoric, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. So keep in mind this. One of the first things I want you to remember, there is a difference between science and scientists. Science is a tool. Scientists are those people who apply that tool in a variety of professional settings, and they do it as professionals. So there's a difference between the tool and the users of the tool. It's just like you could say there are woodworking tools and there are carpenters who do things with those woodworking tools. The tools themselves, they're neutral. They can be used for a variety of things. The person who wields the tools, they wield those tools according to their own biases and other issues that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. So there's a big difference between scientific statements and statements of scientists. Scientific statements are those statements that they conform with very strict rules, and they can be considered with a high degree of trust. Statements by scientists may in fact be scientific statements, but many, many times those statements by scientists are really a reflection of their own biases. And as such, they can't be considered statements of science. The problem is that we as people have a tendency to give a lot of credence to the opinions and thoughts of those people we trust. And that can be a good thing because it's a time saver. You assume this person has done the research and has the information necessary to say things that are true. They've summarized everything nicely. But on the other hand, people, because they have their own biases, they tend to speak through their own lenses. And as a result, you can't necessarily trust the things that they say. So it's like, let the buyer beware. We need to be aware that we can't trust everything anyone says, whether they be scientist, pastor, philosopher, teacher, anyone. We should always seek to get the facts for ourselves. So in order to make the most sense out of this, I want to start with a definition. What is science? Think about that in your own mind. What do you think science is? It probably has sort of a vague definition in your own mind, but what I want to tell you is that science is simply a method of inquiry. It's a tool to answer questions and solve problems. And it's a fairly straightforward process. It's a lot like a recipe. So the scientific method works like this. The scientific recipe works like this. You start with a question or a problem. I wonder why this is the case, or what would happen if I do that, or would this particular medication treat this particular illness, or whatever. You start with a question. The next step is you have to operationalize this question. You have to state it in the form of a hypothesis or a question that can be tested. So you come up with a question that can be tested. The next step is you design a methodology that you're going to follow in order to answer that question. And you write it down. This isn't something that you just make up, right? It's like when you build a house, you don't just buy a bunch of lumber and start cutting wood and nailing it together, right? You start with some blueprints. Well, the research design is like the blueprint of the house that you're going to use to answer the question. So once you have your research design created, it's going to identify things such as what data do you need to answer the question? Where are you going to get the data? How are you going to analyze the data? What are the problems that you're going to encounter? You're documenting everything you're going to do up front to answer this particular question. Once you have that all set up, the next stage is what we call data collection, where you go out and you collect the data that you had decided in advance that you're going to collect. And you collect that data and you store it. Once you finish your data collection, you analyze that data using a wide variety of statistical tools that are available. And these kind of range from simple to the very complex statistical tools. And those statistical tools allow you to determine the probability that, now let me restate that. Those statistical tools will allow you to make a determination. I'm going to simplify this. There are scientists who would probably complain about this. I know statistics teachers would. These tools will help you to determine whether or not the answer to your question is what you think it is, or if it's something else. And so that's your statistical analysis phase. So once you've analyzed your data, you draw your conclusions and you document those conclusions. So it goes like this: question, research design, data collection, data analysis, documentation of findings. That is the scientific method. And that's in a nutshell what scientists do, regardless of the field that they're working in, whether it's biology or astrophysics or chemistry or nanotechnology or whatever it is. That's the process that science follows to answer questions. And it doesn't stop there, though. That's the scientific method in a nutshell. But in addition to science, there's something that I like to call the scientific enterprise. Now, the scientific enterprise is the collection of all scientists everywhere who are working to understand the universe around us and to increase the available knowledge of everything, right? That's the scientific enterprise. And so as part of the scientific enterprise, what I would do as a researcher is I would conduct my study, I would write up my findings, and I submit them to what's called a peer-reviewed journal. Remember I mentioned early on in the introduction about the pastor who saw peer review as like a form of prostitution. But let me tell you how this peer review works. And I know because I've published in peer-reviewed journals. So I complete my research. I write it up in the form of a research article, and I submit it to a journal that specializes in the topic that I'm studying. Could be the journal Nature, could be the Journal of the American Medical Association. It could be the Journal of Applied Psychology or whatever, a scientific journal. And what happens at that journal is they receive your article, they remove the cover page with your name on it, so that now what you have is an anonymous article. Now, why is it anonymous? Because they don't want anyone to know who wrote it. Because of our tendency to give extra authority to people who are well known, we don't want that to happen in science, right? We want the research to stand on its own. And so the research article without the author's name is then sent to a panel of experts in that particular field: biology, geology, chemistry, medicine. It's sent to these peer reviewers who each independently review that research article, and they're looking for flaws. They're looking for incorrect methodology. They're looking for problems with your data. Is it biased? Is it skewed in some way? Are things missing? Stuff like that. They're looking at the research hypothesis. Was it clearly stated? Does it leave wiggle room that can lead to misunderstandings or misinterpretations of the findings of the research study. I mean, all of this is part of peer review. And if the peer reviewers find any problems, they note what the problems are, they provide it back to the editor at the journal, who provides it back to the researcher, so that they have an opportunity to really tighten up their study and address any potential problems and make any adjustments necessary that would allow people to have the greatest possible confidence in the findings of that study. And and then once they've made those corrections, they send it back. You might go through this process a couple of times, but in the end, the study will, if it meets the highest quality standards, then it gets published and it becomes part of what's called the body of scientific literature. And then other people can review it. And here's an important point: they can replicate it, because they look at your findings, they look at your methodology, so other scientists can go out and replicate your study. If they get the same findings you found, that increases confidence that what you found is true. If they get different findings, that decreases confidence that what you said is true. And if nobody can replicate your findings, they throw it out. Right here is where one of the main problems occurs in our culture today. We have a 24-hour news cycle, and they're constantly looking for things to get people to watch. You know, there's a saying in the news industry: if it bleeds, it leads. And and when it comes to science, scientists, whenever they conduct a study, the findings of science are always considered tentative, because it's always possible they could be disproven if they can't be replicated, or if new evidence comes along. So scientific findings are considered tentative. But what happens is someone conducts a study that makes a claim. Drinking wine is good for your health, or I could come up with a bunch of examples where, taking vitamin C, reduces your risk of cancer, whatever it happens to be. People come up with these, they do studies and they find some preliminary findings, and then the media grabs hold of it and publishes it. Have you ever heard this? Scientists have found that taking high doses of vitamin D can do, fill in the blank, right? And so they throw that claim out there with the statement, scientists have found, and people hear that and they take it as true. Well, but then later on, other people replicate the study and they find out that they can't replicate it. So in other words, those initial findings were simply statistical flukes. Then what happens is the media grabs a hold of that and says, scientists found that taking high doses of vitamin D have no effect on fill in the blank. And what is the person on the street supposed to think? Yesterday, science said one thing. Today, science says another thing. Science is simply doing what science does best, which is try to uncover the truth of how things are working in the material world. But because of the extraordinary claims that are being bandied about by people who are looking for headlines, science ends up looking like they're either incompetent or there's just you can't have confidence in their findings. And so it undermines confidence in science in general. And it's unfortunate, because science is doing exactly what science should do. So enough about what science is. A point I want to make is that all science makes certain assumptions of all the research that it does. And these assumptions are this: whenever you study something scientifically, it has to be measurable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable. So if you have a question you want to answer, it has to be something that is measurable, because you can't test something that you can't measure. Let me ask you a question. Does God exist? How would you measure that? How would you test it? There are questions that can be asked that simply don't lend themselves to scientific inquiry. From the scientific perspective, one of the things that scientists will often say is that if you cannot measure it, it doesn't exist. Now, it doesn't mean that it literally doesn't exist. It just means that from the scientific perspective, where you test, measure, repeat, falsify, if you can't do these things with the question that you're seeking to answer, it's simply not a scientific question. Here's another question. Why am I here? Well, scientists could look at it and say, well, you're here because your mom and dad got together and they fertilized an egg and you were born and here you are. Well, that's the mechanism of how I'm here. But if I want to know the answer to the purpose, why am I here? That's a question science can't answer. It's outside the realm of science. And there's where a lot of people get confused because they think that science uncovers truth. Well, actually, science only uncovers the answers to certain kinds of questions. And even the answers that science generates, a true scientist will never say, science has proven A to be true. Scientists won't do that because the very nature of the scientific enterprise is we speak in terms of something called statistical significance, which means we can say with a high degree of confidence that it's true. And the more time researchers can replicate and find the same findings under different circumstances, that confidence goes way up to the point that we might be 99.999999% confident that it's true. There is still a possibility, however, how small, that some data, something will emerge tomorrow that shows that in spite of what we thought we were seeing, it's actually something different. And this is a really critical point. So, does science disprove God? Science is absolutely neutral with respect to the existence of God because God is not a testable hypothesis, right? And it's not just God, it's many, many other of the most important questions that people have simply are not within the realm of scientific inquiry. And so we have to keep this straight because in our Western culture, we tend to equate science with truth, science with effectiveness, because man, heaven knows we can just look around and look at the amazing wonders that we have. I'm sitting here in front of a camera that's recording what I say. I have a wireless microphone. I'll be able to put this on the internet. I have incredible medical care. I have a television. I have all these things which are truly remarkable examples of what science can accomplish. But all of those examples deal with things in the material world. And none of them deal with unmeasurable, untestable, unrepeatable kinds of things. It's a critical thing to keep in mind. So no, science does not disprove God. It just simply is outside of the realm of science. Another way of saying what I just said is that science is what we call value-free. Science takes no stand on good or bad, right or wrong. Science is simply a mechanistic, observational, testable process to seek to try to answer questions and solve problems. That's all it is. It doesn't care about the actual findings. The scientific method is simply a process to generate reliable findings, whatever they are. So that's science. Now, keep in mind, though, there's a difference between science and scientists. Science is a value-free tool designed to answer questions and solve problems. Scientists, on the other hand, are human beings full of flaws that carry with them all the baggage of their upbringing and their experiences and their beliefs about the world. And when they wield the tool of science, they actually impact the findings that they'll have. Let me give you an example. Scientists ask questions, even the very questions that they decide to study. Why do they study this question and not that question? Why are they interested in this and not that? Why do they select this data and not that data? All that is based on the decision of the scientist, and that scientist is biased. And so as a result, the results or the findings of science can actually be quite biased. Why? Because there's a whole host of things that are never considered. And as a result, science never even takes the opportunity to find these things. So I'm going to give you an example, not to get political at all, but I think there is a lot of truth in this. In our current world, in the United States, our approach to food and feeding is an approach geared toward high efficiency, rapidity, abundance, and maximum productivity and maximum progress, maximum profits. So as a result, our system of growing food, processing food, delivering food in this country is highly processed, highly treated with pesticides, genetically modified, all of these things. And I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying it's a thing, right? And it's a thing that results from the worldview of our culture. We want to have a lot of food. We want it fast. We want it high quality. We want it tasty, and whatever it takes to, another plane flying overhead. It's fire season. It's fire season in California. So whatever it takes to accomplish that, that's what we do. So are there a lot of studies being conducted in the United States on genetically modified foods and their health effects? Not really. Why? Is it because it's not a reasonable question? No, I mean, it is a reasonable question. But what we do is we tend to take a shortcut and say there's no reason to believe it should be a problem based on what we're doing here. And so we just sort of accept it as what we call an a priori assumption, and we move on. Now in Europe, they take a completely different approach. Their approach to food is high quality, maximum healthfulness, good for the environment, all of these things. And so they try to really control pesticide use, genetically modified food, all of these kinds of things. Again, I'm not going to say that's good or bad. I'm saying that's their worldview. And so when you think about it, the questions that scientists choose to study are actually limited by their worldviews. And it actually gets worse. Scientists may receive grant funding. Now, ideally, in the scientific enterprise, the grant funding should not influence their questions or their findings. But people are people. If someone is paying for your lab and paying for all these things, even if you're the most ethical scientist in the world, it's hard to not let that stuff influence you. There's another problem that occurs in science, and we call it a bias towards statistically significant findings. So in research journals, when a study is conducted, if there is a statistically significant finding, in other words, means that it uncovers something new and interesting, there's a bias toward publishing that kind of article. But if someone conducted the same study and found no statistically significant finding, meaning there really were no results to support their claim, that type of study does not get published nearly as much. Why? Well, because the pages in journals are fairly limited, and the authors or the editors of journals, they want to present the interesting findings. And so as a result, there's this bias that gets introduced into the whole scientific enterprise. But again, that's to be differentiated from science itself. The scientific method is an unbiased, amazing tool that has just revolutionized our world. If we didn't have the scientific method, which gave us our modern agriculture and so many things that we have now, we would we would be in terrible, terrible straits. Um, so science is a blessing, but it also is a curse because humans are involved in the process. And don't think you can get away with using AI to do science because someone had to train the AI models. And those models also are infected by the bias of those people who designed it. Now I'm going off on a long tangent here. I just wanted to make it clear that science is impacted by the worldview of the people doing science. Now, when it comes to worldviews in our culture, there are two primary worldviews that exist. One is called materialism, and one, you might just call it theism. One believes, and this is materialism, materialism believes that all there is matter and energy. There's nothing beyond that. All there is the universe and what's in it. Everything else doesn't exist. And they believe in a way of thinking called the uniformity of natural causes in a closed system. Now, what do I mean by this? Uniformity of natural causes, which means things happen uniformly, consistently over time in a closed system. And in other words, everything is related causally and effect, like cause and effect, to everything else in the universe, but it's not impacted by anything outside of the universe. That's materialism. And so materialists do not believe in God. They don't believe in the supernatural. And as a result, their approach to the scientific inquiry is going to always assume that all there is material causes and nothing else. Now, theists, or people who believe in God and the supernatural, they tend to accept the premise that, yes, the universe exists and that things typically happen in a cause-effect manner, but they believe that a mind that exists outside the universe from time to time reaches in and affects the system in ways that are within his power because it's his system, right? So theists typically believe in what's called the uniformity of natural causes. In other words, things typically happen, cause and effect, within a limited system. Some might say an open system, which means that while things typically happen according to cause and effect, God can intervene should he want to. So you have two worldviews, materialism and theism. People from both worldviews can use the same scientific method. And so you can have people of all faiths can do science, and materialists can do science. But the fact remains that if you're doing science, all you can do is study things that can be measured, tested, repeated, and falsified. Because science itself could care less what your beliefs are, right? That's the truth of things. So we need to understand that. So to the extent that there's a conflict between science and religion, why does that conflict exist? And I want to read to you another quote. This is by a gentleman named, he's Dr. Richard Lewontin. He's a world famous Harvard geneticist. And he wrote this in the New York Review of Books on January 9th, 1997. And I'm quoting this from a book of a really interesting writer and speaker. Should you look him up on YouTube or look for his books, his name is John Lennox. He's professor emeritus of mathematics at Oxford University. He also has, I think, a master's degree in philosophy of science and a degree in bioethics. Brilliant man. So this is what Richard Lewontin, the Harvard geneticist, wrote. And listen carefully to what he says. Our willingness to accept claims that are against common sense is key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. I'm going to pause. So in other words, scientists are willing to accept claims that are against common sense. They make no sense. Understanding this is key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. And this is what Lewontin says. We take the side of science. Why? In spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs. Yeah, some of what we're saying is absurd, but we take this in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. So in other words, scientists are willing to sort of accept just so stories. Why? Because we have a prior commitment to materialism. In other words, many scientists, those who are materialists, they come at the world from the perspective of materialism. That is all they're going to be willing to accept. They're not willing to accept any possible explanations that go beyond simply the material world. And so anyway, continuing, Mr. Lewontin or Dr. Lewontin said, it's not that the methods, and listen to this, it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, and this is key to understanding the tension between science and religion. On the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produces material explanations, listen to this, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And why? Why must we hold on to materialism? Moreover, that materialism is absolute because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And there you have it. The tension between science and religion really comes down to the fact that, at least for materialist scientists, they're unwilling to allow a divine foot in the door. That closes off any consideration of questions or evidence or methodology or anything from people who come as their primary worldview, someone who believes that there's a God. And so that is why people often perceive as science as being atheistic. It's not because science is atheistic, it's because the scientists who are applying the tool, many of them, excuse me, are atheistic. But let me ask you this. Are all of them atheistic? I have a statistic that's kind of surprising. Did you know that if you were to look at the 20th century and look at the number of Nobel Prizes that were awarded, what percent of those Nobel Prizes in hard sciences went to Christians? So I'm going to read you a quote, again, from Professor John C. Lennox, who's quoting from another author, who, like I said, he's a professor emeritus at Oxford University in mathematics. He wrote, in the 20th century, rather than being less represented in the scientific disciplines, Christians made up just under 2/3 of those receiving the physics and medicine Nobel Prize awards. So 64% of Nobel Prize awards in physics went to Christians or people with Christian backgrounds, and 65% went to those earning Nobel Prizes in medicine. Isn't that surprising? Based on what you would think that these are sciences. I mean, surely they don't believe in God, but that's not the case. And it says, while the figure was even higher for chemistry, as they accounted for nearly 3/4 of the Nobel Prize winners, 74%. As for the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, if you exclude those peace prizes that are going to organizations, 78% of them went to Christians, 11% to Jews, only 4% went to non-believers of any kind, 2% to Buddhists, 2% to Muslims, 1% to Quakers, and 1% to those holding Shinto beliefs. Does that sound like religion is a poison to you? Does that sound like religion is going to get good people to do bad things? If The majority of people winning Nobel Peace Prizes for doing good to humanity are actually people of faith, as opposed to those who are non-believers. What's more, only 11% of Nobel Prize winners went to atheists, and the majority of them were in literature rather than the hard sciences. So there you have it. In the modern world, there are plenty of scientists who believe that God exists. They may not necessarily have a conservative view of Christianity, but they believe God exists and they would count themselves as Christians. And you know, it's surprising to me. Well, it shouldn't be surprising, but it is. If you go back to the roots of science, would it surprise you to know that there are a fair number of non-believing historians of science who actually attribute the Judeo and Christian worldview with the formation of science in the first place? If you were to go back to the ancient Greeks, they didn't create the scientific method. We didn't experience the scientific revolution in Greece or in Babylon or in Rome or in modern India or in the Middle East or anywhere like that. We instead, Christianity, or rather not Christianity, science emerged from a group of people who held to a Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, you might reasonably ask, well, why would that be the case? And it's basically this. If you go back to the ancient Greeks, those people were smart. They didn't have any of the technology that we have, and yet they accomplished absolutely remarkable things. They even calculated the dimensions of the Earth, or the circumference of the Earth, fairly accurately, with nothing but their minds and a few crude tools. They were able to calculate things like that. But why didn't they make this the next step to look for the laws of science, to look for the laws of the universe, to try to understand how things work? There's a simple explanation for it. Their gods were too small. The ancient Greeks and the Romans and the Babylonians and the Egyptians, their gods were much more like humans. They were powerful. They may have been immortal, but they were actually like spoiled children. I mean, look at the Greek gods. They kidnapped people. They impregnated women. They punished people capriciously. They were proud and arrogant. They were unpredictable. How could the Greeks ever come to the point where they believed that the universe operated according to set laws? But if you look at the Bible begins with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the whole rest of the Bible, the image of God is a being, an intelligent creator who created things, and he operated according to laws. The Jews, all of the laws that they received in the Old Testament, they spoke of organization and order and consistency. And there are places in the Old Testament where God, in referring to himself, he says, I am the Lord. I do not change. I'm not a man that I should lie. I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so, as C.S. Lewis wrote in his book, Mere Christianity, he said, men became scientific because they believed in law in nature. And they believed in law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So the people back at the time of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, the only reason they believed that the universe could be understood and that these laws might be able to be ferreted out is because, one, they believed in a rational God who created the universe and who created people. And they believed that since he created people in his own image, they had an intellect that may just be up to the task of understanding the world that God had created. They had a reason to expect that there was something there to find beneath what often appeared to be randomly complex things. And so they began searching. And it's no wonder that starting with Galileo, who turned his telescope to the sky. I'll talk about him in just a moment. Sir Isaac Newton, perhaps the most brilliant scientist of all time. In a way, science was his hobby. He was a very deep thinking theologian. And when he wrote his book, Principia Mathematica, which is like perhaps the most influential scientific treatise of all time, that really kickstarted the understanding of gravity in the world, all these other things, he actually wrote that it was his hope that his writing would get thinking people to believe in God. And he discovered the laws of gravity, and he invented calculus. He was a Christian. Sir James Clerk Maxwell, another Christian, he discovered the laws of magnetism. Are you grateful for your microwave oven and all of your electronics? Thank a Christian. Michael Faraday, another Christian, he discovered aspects of the laws of magnetism and rotary induction, like motors and things like that. Michael Faraday, on his deathbed, someone came to him and said, Sir Michael, do you have any speculations now? His response was, speculations, man? I have none. I know him whom I have believed, and he is able to keep that which I have entrusted to him. Antoine Lavoisier, the founder of modern chemistry, a Christian. Gregor Mendel, founder of the science of genetics, a Christian. Blaise Pascal, renowned physicist, mathematician, and philosopher, Christian. These leading minds, these giants upon whose shoulders the scientists of today stand, were Christians. I would argue that if the people back at the time of the original scientific revolution, if they held to beliefs such as materialistic scientists have today, beliefs that the universe evolved randomly and that everything thereafter resulted from random chaos, they would have had no reason whatsoever to believe that there were any laws to be discovered. So, in conclusion, I just want to say, there is no tension between religion and science when science is correctly understood. Science is value-free. Science is a tool. Science is neutral on the concept of God. Everything else that science generates, whether you're talking about the Big Bang, the theory of evolution, scientific creationism, whatever it is, these are all hypotheses that if you're using the scientific method correctly, you apply the scientific method to the hypotheses and you evaluate the evidence and you draw your conclusions. That is how science is supposed to operate. So if you're a Christian and you find yourself being anti-science, please keep in mind that God gave us science. God was the one who wrote in Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." He gave us minds and a universe and the ability to understand a bit of his amazing power in Godhead through the things that have been created. If you're an atheist and you don't believe in God, that's totally fine. But stop using your atheism and your materialism as if that's the only possible worldview that an intelligent and thinking person can have. Recognize that you're a person of biases, just as Christians are, just as Muslims are, just as every other human being has biases. So let's have humility as we relate to each other. Let's know what our own beliefs are, our own biases are, and let's be very careful and respectful with one another. Now, as a Christian, I would add to this, that if there is in fact a God who is beyond all things, who is all powerful, all-knowing, and he exists beyond space and time. If I start with there as a premise, whether or not it's true, I'm just saying if that is my premise, it's important to realize that we will discover nothing about this God from our examination of the material world beside two important facts. And Paul mentions these two important facts in the first chapter of the book of Romans in the New Testament. He says, by the things that are made, we can determine two things. that God exists, his eternal power and Godhead, and we can see how powerful he is. That's all we can determine. If God wants us to know anything else about him, he's going to have to reveal himself to us. And he does that, at least according to the beliefs of Jews and Christians. And he did that by inspiring individual writers over 1,000 years of time, from kings to peasants, from priests and prophets to shepherds. He inspired these different people over long periods of time with aspects of his character, with things he wanted humanity to know, because we would have no other way to know them unless this being that exists be outside of our ability to detect, unless he chose to reveal him. And if he did choose to reveal them, we're really doing ourselves a disservice by at least not considering the things that he said. And even though he gave us this word in the Bible, it wasn't enough, because people still couldn't grasp the nature of what he's like. And so the Bible tells us that in the fullness of time, God came himself in the form of Jesus Christ to clear up some misunderstandings about what he's like, because people of all ages have feared God, have seen him as a tyrant and negative, and in spite of the things in the Bible that say to the otherwise, so God comes himself in the form of Jesus. He lived among us. He walked with us. He ate with us. He healed people. He talked about what the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, it's not an issue of scientific inquiry. It's an issue of faith. That is an issue of faith. And it's not just a faith, as I mentioned earlier, that's in the absence of evidence. Those of us who have come to know this God, we experience him deeply in our hearts, and he's changed our lives. There are people who have been rescued from all sorts of terrible life situations and have emerged new people. That is a form of evidence. It may not be scientific evidence that can be tested and repeated and manipulated, but it is a form of evidence. And if you haven't experienced it, I would encourage you to confront this being who claims to exist and who claims to work miracles in people's lives, and ask him to show you if he exists. And if you ask with an open heart and make yourself willing to question your assumptions, I personally believe you will discover at the bottom of all things is a God who loves you. This has been a long presentation. My camera has shut off several times due to overheating. Hopefully I'll be able to edit it all right. But I just have so much I wanted to talk about. I hope you found it useful and interesting and not too boring. And I hope it opens your eyes to some aspects of science you may not have thought about before. So once again, I'm Jim Higgins. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this presentation, I would encourage you to subscribe to it, to share it with others, and to give it a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. Have a great day. Thanks again for watching.